But as the idea of independence from the British began to swirl around America's 13 colonies, one could feel the vibrations of war rattling the air already. With the controversial Stamp Act of 1763, New York shot to the forefront of the independence movement in the colonies with the help of the Sons of Liberty. Despite some New Yorkers opposing the idea of breaking free from their British overlords, there was little to do to stop the downward spiral now. War was on the horizon. One could only hope it would go smoothly. Almost 1/3 of every battle fought in the American Revolution was done so on New York's battered ground. General George Washington spent much attention on the fight for New York, and when independence was declared in the summer of 1776, New York had endorsed the Declaration. Although the British would hold New York City captive for the entirety of the war, the locals fought hard to free their territory in its entirety nonetheless. When the war finally ended and all of New York was restored to the Americans, the recaptured city of NYC would serve a short term as the capital of the nation, after New York State would be the 11th to ratify the new United States Constitution. The 1777 Constitution of New York had, in fact, served as quite an inspiration for the federal Constitution in 1788. Similarly, New York City was the capital of the state, not just the country, off and on until 1797, when New Yorkers shifted their metropolis to Albany. Many of America's important moments throughout history took place in New York. The Bill of Rights was written up in the state's borders. George Washington was inaugurated as America's first president in NYC. The U.S. Supreme Court was birthed there. The founding of the New York Stock Exchange, of course, happened in the state, and so many other crucial events. The War of 1812 would use New York as a battleground, just as the Revolution had. New York was growing still in so many ways. As time went on, the state was relying less and less on agriculture for success. New transportation creations involving steamboats and trains made New York a convenient place for travel, and the opening of the Erie Canal added another boost of attraction. Natives at this time were now secluded to a dozen reservations, whilst others had been sent into exile or died for their decision to support the British in the Revolutionary War. Alongside these reservations sat a growing list of towns, businesses, schools, farms, churches, theaters, athletics, and a building mood of abolitionism. By the mid-19th century, the governor of New York, William H. Seward, worked with the state's legislature to protect and expand the rights of both runaway slaves and free blacks within the state. The state, though hosting some hesitant Democrats, thus quickly joins the efforts of Abraham Lincoln with the outbreak of the Civil War, and New York ultimately would supply more manpower than any other northern state for the fighting effort. Quite unlike the Revolutionary War, however, not a single battle broke out on New York soil. There was, however, significant unrest from the locals in 1863, when the Union pushed forth a draft law that required all male citizens between the ages of 20 and 35 and single males up to the age of 45 to be eligible for a draft. You could pay your way out of the conscription, but not every New Yorker could afford that. Mid-July saw an outbreak of massive and rather violent protests deemed the draft riots across NYC. These demonstrations were led predominantly by ethnic Irish New Yorkers and often targeted Black Americans and their communities, causing a notable exodus of the latter from certain areas. The unrest fizzled out when the North opted to allow some Black Americans to fight in their own regiments, calming fears from European Americans that the draft was taking their own jobs away and giving them to the free Black men. With the war's end, then came more immigration and more freedom for Black New Yorkers. A large portion still of New York's growing population was European, with many immigrants coming from Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. But there was also a curious number of Chinese immigrants arriving around 1850. New York was becoming increasingly diverse and exceedingly prosperous as a state, with more workers flooding in. By the turn of the 20th century, the population of New York State had exceeded 7 million. These millions of New Yorkers would see the events of the 1900s, from the World Wars and the Great Depression to the start of the modern era. Today, New York remains one of the most populous states in the US and one of the nation's most popular tourist attractions. Modern-day New Yorkers have seen tragedy and triumph of their own, and their ancestors could say the same. The history of New York State is deeply intertwined with that of its country, and without New York, who knows what the United States would be like today.